Well, hey there, and welcome on in to another episode of the Winsome Creationist here with me. I'm your host, Steve Schramm, and we are going to talk about something today that I think will be useful for you, a way of thinking more clearly about what you read in the biblical text. We're going to use specifically some examples from creationism here, something that will help with your own thinking, but that I think will also help you in your conversations with maybe old earth creationists or what I call no age creationists, just people who completely disagree with us on our interpretation of Genesis. I think again more and more it's going to be helpful for us to have conversations that are productive with people who disagree with us because otherwise there's no hope of them ever seeing our view. But even worse than that, they're going to lose respect, frankly. Already, a lot of these other groups have lost respect for creationists because we're not good at engaging in dialogue with the other side. We got to get better at that. And I think today's topic is going to be something useful, both for you internally as you seek to understand your own views better, and then also as you are in conversation with others. Okay. And what I want to talk about specifically today is the distinction between inspiration, interpretation, and then implications. Inspiration, interpretation, and then implications. This is three different layers or levels of understanding a claim, okay, of understanding something that you read in the Bible. And what's often done is that two or sometimes even all three of these get simply smushed into a pile together, right? And they're not clearly thought about as distinct pieces of data. And when that happens, then we start throwing rocks. We start with the insults, and we really fail to communicate. And when we fail to communicate, then that just shuts everything else down, and there's no hope of recovering in there. So, what we need to do is be sure that we don't conflate, that is, we don't treat as equal how we understand something and what that understanding or what the view itself would imply with what God said. Okay, so there's three layers. There's inspiration, there's what God said. Okay, there is interpretation, there's how we understand what God said. And then there is implications. Okay, if we understand what God said this way, then here is the case, right? Here is what must be true. And what we'll do to kind of walk through this here is we will look at three different very common examples. I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel and digging obscure passages out of the Bible here. Okay, we're going to talk about three different issues that are very just prominent and talked about all the time within creation circles. And then we're going to look at how we can think about these internally and how we can sort of conversate about these as well, given this distinction. Now, I see more and more new books that are starting to crop up, more and more just arguments on social media of people who are really trying to hammer in this issue that the creation, the agree to disagree nature of the creation debate is essentially settled. That's been decided. We need to unite and move on to other things. My book is not going to agree with that approach. Now, it's not going to specifically denigrate that approach either, but most certainly when I come out with this book next year called The Winsome Creationist, we're not going to be taking the position in the book that we should just stop talking about our view, that we should just pretend like creationism isn't a big deal to us, that we should just pretend like, well, there's multiple views on the age of the earth and multiple, all kinds of different people who are Christians believe all kinds of different things. This is a secondary thing that doesn't matter. There's another push that I feel like is happening for the creation debate in general to go that direction. And I disagree with that take. I disagree with that approach. I can agree with being nice and with agreeing to disagree with brothers and sisters, but I absolutely think we should still try to win them to this view because, number one, I think it's biblically correct, but importantly, because of what it implies, because of the implications that come along with either accepting or rejecting this view. At the same time, a lot of the complaint from that crowd who just does want to let sleeping dogs lie, let this issue fade into blackness and just pretend it goes away. A lot of their issue is with creationists conflating inspiration and interpretation. At least that's their take on what's going on. Okay, their take is that we are conflating what God said with our understanding of what God said, and their evidence for that is that there are multiple views within Christianity. And again, when we look at that, that's where we have to take a look at the implications and see, well, okay, well, let's follow your view to its logical conclusion and see what it implies. Let's follow my view to its logical conclusion and see what implies and what it implies, and then may the best idea win. Okay, but we do have to realize that we're not perfect. Sometimes we're going to get things wrong. Our interpretation of the text may not be exactly accurate, but their interpretation of the text may not be exactly accurate. And so you have to look at these issues on a case-by-case basis. But the point today, if you can take away one thing from what we talk about, is not to have specific examples, even though we're going to talk through those. The big idea is that you're able to separate these three categories and talk individually about them and keep a conversation between you and somebody else on track as it relates to them. Okay? Inspiration, interpretation, and implications. Okay, so let's look at these three different things I want to talk about. The first one is the days of Genesis 1. Okay, again, like I said, we're not rooting up random stuff from the Bible here. These are topics that come up all the time in creationism, each of the three that we're going to talk about. The first one, probably the most common, okay? The days in Genesis 1. Are those days literal solar 24-hour days, or are they not? Are they not? So let's look at the inspiration. Okay, from the inspiration standpoint, when you read the text of Scripture, okay, it reads, and Exodus 20:11 reads, like these are ordinary solar days. Now, that is not an interpretive comment that I'm making. I'm making an objective statement about the text, okay? The way that the text is written and the way that in Exodus 20:11, the Israelite week is patterned after the week of creation. These days, as written, are ordinary solar days. That's what the text says. Now, whether or not it's what the text means is a matter of interpretation, but it's what the text says, okay? And you are not going to find a Hebrew scholar who will be very kind to other takes on this, like that the days are literal days, but that the literal definition could be expanded beyond something else. I am not aware, and if you could find one for me, please do. But since, what was the guy's? I don't even remember the guy's name. But the Gleason Archer, is that right? I'm not sure if that's right. But there was a Hebraist who, was sort of pretty popular in that he would make the rounds on these different TV shows and stuff with Hugh Ross in the 90s, and he would promote this idea that there was multiple literal definitions of the word day in Hebrew, and that these verses, could mean something different. As far as I'm aware, from my reading, that view has been pretty much discredited and rejected. And most Hebraists, whether or not they agree that the Israelites meant a 24-hour day, they agree with that's what the text says. Okay, so whether or not they literally meant that it was 24 hours and that we are supposed to think as readers of the text that it was truly 24 hours, that's in the interpretation bucket. In the inspiration bucket, what is written down on the page is that these are 24 24-hour days. Now, so there's the inspiration part on this first example, the days of Genesis 1. What I would seek to do in a conversation with somebody is get extremely clear about that. Don't move on to interpretation until we first understand the inspiration. Now, and it's a fair question that would come up right here. Well, how can you possibly separate the two? Well, you absolutely can. You can, because that's their entire argument, is that you can separate the two, and you certainly can. It's like, is the Bible, the inspiration, is the Bible inspired to say something that would agree more with the idea of a theory of the atonement versus another theory of the atonement, or are biblical statements written in such a way that it affirms Calvinism versus Arminianism? I mean, the reason that there are different takes on these items is because there is a thing that the text says, and then also a way of understanding the text and working through what's called the hermeneutical spiral to actually go through and actually interpret the text. These are two different things. So the inspiration and the interpretation can be separated from one another. Now, that is not to say that pure subjectivity is the answer either. Well, it could mean this, it could mean that. No, there is a meaning. I mean, there is an intended meaning, and it is our job to the best of our ability and within the realm of our conscience, to come to a meaning and interpretation of what the text says so that we can then apply it to our lives, okay? And again, in this context, I'm not going the route of application. Instead, I'm going the route of implication. So I'm not saying necessarily, what does this mean for my life? Okay, how do I apply this thinking to my life, even though it may come along with it? When we get to the implications part, I'm saying, what does this imply about my view of the rest of the Bible, or my outlook, my take on how the physical world works, okay? So implications are downstream from these other things. But you got to have, what did God say? How do I understand it? And then what does it mean? So, days of Genesis 1, okay? Inspiration, it says these are literal 24-hour solar days. Interpretation. Now, as long as you're clear on that first step, you can move into interpretation. Now, my interpretation, and presumably yours if you're listening, is that these, in fact, are meant to be the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, the first readers of these texts would have understood that Moses intended, or whoever wrote Genesis 1, I believe it was Moses, but you might have a different view. I believe Moses wrote Genesis 1, and that he intended to communicate that indeed the world was created in 6 literal 24-hour solar days, okay? I don't believe that it was some other analogical thing, or just some nice framework or pattern. There might be a nice literary framework or pattern. There might be an analogy involved, but I believe that the text was written to communicate that indeed the world was created in 6 24-hour solar days. And so you're going to ask them, what's your interpretation of what those days mean? How should we take them? Assuming we agree about what the text says, about what God said, how do you understand the text to be communicating? And what's your reasons? And then you just go back and forth on the reasons, okay? You weigh the evidence. You're going to come to the table, hopefully prepared with some evidence of your own for why you think the view is correct, that they should be viewed as literal days. And hopefully they're going to come to the table with some ideas of why they think that the world was stated to have been created in 6 24-hour days, but that actually it was some other kind of thing. And they're going to have arguments for that, and it's your responsibility to know how to answer those. Okay, and then you move into the implications phase. Okay, well, the implications for science, especially here, are drastic. The way that we understand God's world, if the creation is old versus if the creation is young, and within a young creation, you're going to have that idea of 6 literal 24-hour days. You're not going to have 6 literal 24-hour days of creation on an old earth creationist view. Okay. Honestly, it's kind of a package deal. I know there's some people who want to separate these out, and yeah, you can slice and dice and separate them out. But at the end of the day, if you've got a 6 day, 24-hour day creation period, then you've got a young Earth. If you've got something else, you've pretty much got an old Earth. Okay, and so that's going to have implications for science. It's going to have philosophical implications about, say, the nature of God and the nature of man. It could have implications as to the truthfulness of God. There's lots of places that it can have implications, and so you take your belief to its logical conclusion. And this is, I tell a story in the book of how Kurt Wise, when he was young and struggling and trying to figure out what it looked like for him to be a creationist, Bible believer, and not to be an evolutionist, because he was so into science and so into evolution, and yet he believed the Bible. Then when he got to this phase in his own study with the implications, he went through and he cut out as much of the Bible that he had to, if he were to believe that evolution were true. Okay, he's like, if evolution is true, I'm going to go cut out the pages that have to be removed from the Bible. And to be fair, he only did every other one, to be fair to the view that evolution was true. And the question was to see if he still had a Bible left afterward. And he tells the story that no, the binding wouldn't even hold the Bible together by the time he made it from Genesis to Revelation, and cut out every verse that he would have to if he were to believe that evolution was true. Now, a drastic example, yes, probably not something you're going to do, something that he claims to have done with trembling hands, and he was not very thrilled about it. But what he did was he followed its view to the logical conclusion by looking at the implications. Views have consequences, and that's what he understood. And so the implications of believing that evolution were true and that the Genesis creation account was not correct meant cutting out most of the Bible, again, because he had already settled on understanding what God said and interpreting it. Okay? All right, so there's an example in the days of Genesis 1. Hopefully you see what we're doing here, so we can move pretty swiftly into the next one. Death before sin, okay? Death before sin. What did God say? What's your interpretation of that? What's their interpretation of that as well? And then what does the view imply about the nature of whatever, about whatever it touches, about science, about the rest of the Bible, about the nature of God, about the nature of man? What does it imply? Okay, very briefly here. Does the Bible state that there was death before sin? No, it does not state that. It doesn't state that. We can surmise that maybe Adam stepped on an ant in the garden or something, but it does not explicitly say that there was death before sin. So then there's the question of, does it say that there was not any death before sin? Little trickier to answer. Again, I'm going to say that no, the Bible does not say directly that there was no death before sin. Now, the Bible does in Romans 5:12. Okay, so this is way later than the Genesis creation account. Way later than that. The Bible does say in Romans that death came through sin. That death came through sin. Now, the context of that passage is very clearly talking about humans. Even most creationists are agreed on this point now. You can't use Romans 5:12 to say that there was no animal death before the fall. You can go to Romans 8. And Romans 8 has some language that would seem to suggest that the whole creation is groaning and from what happened in the garden and the entrance of sin and death into the world. And you can make an argument from Romans 8 about animal death, but even that, it's not direct, and it's certainly not in the account. Okay? It's not in the account of Genesis 1. So what do we do there? What do we do there? Well, the first mention of animal death that we have in the Bible does come after sin. Okay? That's in Genesis 3. And in Genesis 1, we are told that animals are not being eaten for food because both humans and animals are vegetarian. Okay? So this is one of those things that gets tricky because it does not say, the Bible does not say the words or anything like the words, there was no death in the creation before sin. It doesn't say those words. And especially it does not say them in the account. And this is where a lot of creationists and anti-creationists, if you will, get tripped up and start talking past each other. Because the creationist wants to do some interpretive work from Genesis 1, 29 and 30 and talk about animals being vegetarian, and then they want to go to Genesis 3 and say that we see the first mention of animal death after sin, and then they want to go to to Romans and start talking about death entering into the world through there. And I sympathize with that, and I understand that, but understand, please, that when you do that, you are making an interpretive move. You are not judging inspiration directly. The inspired statements are that man and animal life were vegetarian. Okay. Another interpretive move here that's made is that the Bible speaks of nephesh life. So while it is possible that Adam stepped on a grasshopper or an ant in the garden, that's 100% possible. Biblically, the Bible does not describe soulish life to those sorts of organisms. But notice that all of this is happening in the realm of interpretation. Okay, we don't have a biblical statement that says there was no death before sin in the garden. We don't have that. And so we must be careful not to argue on the inspiration angle there. Now, where we can argue inspiration there is we can hold people like Hugh Ross to the flame. So Hugh Ross has made the claim before that, yes, humans were vegetarian, but animals were not necessarily vegetarian. Now, this is odd to me because, again, I think, and maybe he just hasn't been pressed on this like he ought to be, but if you've got Genesis 1, 29 and 30 back to back making the vegetarian argument, it's really hard to argue that that humans would not be carnivorous, but that animals would be, because the statements are used in conjunction as if they're saying the same thing. And so what I find interesting is that Hugh Ross doesn't usually use this passage to build his argument for man being vegetarian. Actually, he goes to the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 and says that man cannot live that long on a meat-based diet, so they were for sure vegetarian. But he makes no such claim about the animals. Okay, so I think you can press a Hugh Ross on Genesis 1, 29 and 30 and be like, but this is what God said, and now we can look at the interpretive meaning of that and then what it implies later down the road. But just make sure that you are having the conversation at the right level. Don't jump into interpretation when you're still trying to figure out inspiration. And this will go a long way with people that you're talking to, because you're going to be sure that they know that you are not trying to conflate the two, that you understand there's a difference between interpretation and inspiration, and also what the implications are. Okay, you understand what there's a difference, and you're trying to honor that difference. So what happens with the implications? Okay, well, the implications here are where this particular example gets really interesting, because one view has disastrous implications, I think, for the nature of humanity and also for science. And the other view has disastrous implications for science and for the nature of humanity. Whichever way you go with this, you've got some difficulty. But one of them is way easier theologically and philosophically than the other one, and that's the young earth creationist view. Okay, the young age creationist view on death before sin makes a lot more sense when you're talking about fossils in the ground, carnivory, the things that we found, the nature of God, and then you can discuss those implications, but make sure that you're discussing them separate from the inspiration and from the interpretation. Okay, last example before we are done for today, and that is the statements of Jesus as it relates to creation. Okay, the most famous one of these is in Mark 10:6. You already know it. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Okay, so what does the text say? Well, sure enough, if you look at Genesis and then you actually look at also these statements of Jesus, you find that the text does say what it sounds like. Okay, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Now, I'm not a Greek scholar. I have looked into this a little bit, and my understanding from asking multiple people who are Greek scholars is that there's no way you can make that statement say, from the beginning of the creation of male and female, God made them male and female. Okay, that's not what is happening. There are also other statements made throughout the New Testament that use this same sort of structure and phraseology that are very clearly referring. One talks about how Abel is the first prophet, right? That are very clearly referring to the beginning time of creation. And the bottom line is that if you put the beginning of creation millions of years and billions of years apart from when God made male and female, then you have literal problems. You have problems with the statements of Jesus. And this is the kind of thing that has led many theistic evolutionists to literally start to claim that Jesus was just wrong when he made statements like this. He was just literally wrong. He was in error because he was basically adopting the cultural mores and ideas of the day, but that he didn't necessarily believe those statements, or he did believe those statements as being factually true, but he was just wrong. And now that's something that we know because we have a full Bible and the full scale context of history that we can look at, whereas Jesus did not have that. So again, it's pretty clear at this point that the inspiration angle of this, it says what it says. It says that male and female were made at the beginning of the creation. Of course, this is where the difference between different camps of creationists gets like exacerbated. It's like we don't think that we should take the Bible so literally that the beginning of creation means the first instant of creation. Okay, we don't think that male and female were created in the first instant of creation, but we believe that they were created during that initial creation week. That time period that we've already established is 6 24-hour days. Okay, so the view as stated is that Adam and Eve were created during that initial period of creation activity of 6 ordinary solar days, not that there was this millions of years long thing. Okay, so then that's the statements, that's the inspiration part. So we interpret that, and the interpretation here, frankly, isn't very hard. Okay, you don't have to do much work to reason that. Honestly, the reasoning work of the interpretation there is really doing the work of realizing that that the words don't need to be pressed for such literality that it means that in the very first instant of creation, the beginning of creation, that they were created. We can just look at it and say, okay, well, when were male and female created? And if we look at the creation account, that is day 6 of creation. Okay, so they're created on day 6, and in general, male and female were created at the beginning of creation, okay, during the creation time, and at that beginning time. That's your interpretation. Now, what are your implications for that? Well, again, they're pretty staggering. Okay, and this is why I believe Jesus was a young age creationist, because the implications of that view are that Adam and Eve were made on the same day as many of the land dwelling animals. That means dogs, cats, and dinosaurs, and buffalo, right? Among other things. And yeah, that means that Adam and Eve lived at the same time as dinosaurs, and that's uncomfortable for some people. Not uncomfortable for me, because I believe God's word, and I just don't see it as being nearly the big problem that many other people do. And not only that, but I believe there's evidence for it. But there's implications. Now, there's also implications if you don't take that view. Because we understand the inspiration and interpretation aspect of this, there are implications. If you don't believe in young age creationism, then you must believe, by logic, that Jesus was wrong. Like I've already mentioned, there are people who take that path. And I can't help somebody who takes that path. If you take that path, fine, just understand what it means. Okay? So you challenge the deity of the Son. You challenge, I think, the ontological Trinity here. If you take this view that Jesus could be wrong about something, I don't think that we can say, and I'm not a scholar on the Trinity or anything like that. I don't think we can say that Jesus was wrong in his knowledge on something, and that be okay. I think we can say that his knowledge was perhaps incomplete. His earthly knowledge, he may have laid down some things and laid aside some things, but I don't think Jesus would be actually wrong about something as fundamental as this. I think that causes tremendous issues for your theology. So that's the implications. Okay. Inspiration, interpretation, and then what the view implies. Okay. And this is the same when you're breaking down somebody else's view. Somebody else comes to you and they say, well, I believe this. Okay. Well, let's look at it. Inspiration. What God say? Interpretation. How do you understand what God said? Implication. Oh, you understand it that way. Well, here's what your view implies. How are you going to deal with that? Okay. This is a way to interrogate what you believe and interrogate what others believe. That should lead to way more productive conversations, I think. Okay, I hope you found this helpful. Again, stay on the lookout for more information about my book, The Winsome Creationist, coming next year. We're going to keep talking about it from time to time here on the podcast, and I'm excited for you to read it and get your hands on it, and I hope you'll find it to be very helpful. In the meantime, we will see you in a couple weeks. I'm not sure yet if we're going to have a podcast episode on Thanksgiving, because I think that's when my next episode would actually come out. As I'm looking at the calendar here, we would skip next week, and then the next one would be on Thanksgiving Day. So I'm not sure whether or not we're actually going to have a podcast that day or not. If we do have one, then I'll see you then. If we don't, happy Thanksgiving. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you guys real soon. Thanks again. Talk soon. Bye.